You're watching DD India News Hour. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran. Going back to the top story, the visiting president of the UN General Assembly says it is high time India became a permanent UN Security Council member. Now, India has been pushing for reform of the world body for years on end now. India believes that UN reform is not complete without changing the composition of the Security Council in both the permanent and non-permanent categories. Mr. Dilip Sinha joins us from New Delhi. Mr. Sinha is a former Indian ambassador to the UN in Geneva and Greece. He is the author of Legitimacy of Power, The Permanence of Five in the Security Council, published in 2018. Ambassador Sinha, welcome to DD India News Hour. Now, first up, everybody agrees that UN Security Council reform is long overdue. So, what's stopping the UN from reforming itself? Where is it stuck and why?
Well, as the UN Secretary General said recently in an address to the General Assembly, that reform is about power. And we know that the Security Council is all about the control of the five big powers over the Council. And we know that some of these big powers are opposed to any reform in the Security Council because they fear that their privileges and their powers will get diluted because of the entry of new members. So the primary obstacle to reform of the UN Security Council is this, the fear of any change in the status quo by the existing powers in the Security Council. Then, of course, there's the other issue of galvanizing the large membership in the General Assembly, which is 193 members, and one requires the support of 2/3 of the members for this, including the support of each of the 5 permanent members. And that itself is not an easy task today in the extremely polarized and also diversified world that we have today, where there are different countries. There is the African Union, which is not able to reach consensus on who will represent Africa in the Reformed Security Council, because, as you know, Africa is has 53, 54 members, and these countries form the subject matter of the largest number of resolutions of the Security Council, and yet Africa also does not have a representative as a permanent member in the Security Council. So these issues all put together, they have held up the reform of the Security Council.
Ambassador Sinha, as a report mentioned at the top of the broadcast, Elon Musk, the founder and owner of Tesla, SpaceX and X, says India not having a permanent UNSC seat is quote-unquote absurd. Now, my question to you is this. If Musk understands it, why can't, say, someone like Xi Jinping?
Well, it is one of those interesting things where the whole world is now saying that the Security Council needs reform, and in that reform, India, which is the most populous country in the world and the largest democracy, must find representation, because no international organization can claim to be a representative organization of the world today, of the current geopolitical realities, unless it includes India. And yet, as China is completely opposed to India's membership, China, as you know, was not originally a permanent member of the Security Council. The People's Republic wasn't. People's Republic became a member merely by a General Assembly resolution. It replaced Taiwan or the Republic of China in 1971, and then it became a permanent member. And ever since has been ensuring 2 things. One is that India does not become a permanent member, and the other that Taiwan does not become a member of the Security of the UN. So these power games that are played by the big powers has become a hindrance to not only the reform of the Security Council, but also its efficacy. In the last 3-4 years, the UN Security Council has seen more vetoes than ever since the Cold War ended. And the Security Council today faces a problem not only of its reform, but of its relevance itself. And the Secretary General himself has recently, in his address to the General Assembly, said that global governance is stuck in time. And he had said earlier that the UN Charter and the values it represents are in jeopardy. and this is a very serious comment to come from the UN Secretary General, who's a very experienced political leader and world leader. And he realizes
Indeed.
that the challenge for the UN today is not just reform of the Security Council, but the very relevance and the existence of the Security Council in the form in which it is today, where it cannot take action in its primary function of maintaining international peace and security. Today, the world is seeing more armed conflicts than ever in the history of the UN. And yet the Security Council is unable to address resolutions on the major wars that are taking place in the world. Those resolutions then get taken up in the General Assembly, but the General Assembly, whose president is currently visiting India and supporting the idea of UN Security Council reform, is unable to act because its resolutions are not binding.
Ambassador Sinha, India's External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar says the UN Summit of the Future to be hosted this year should serve as a serious opportunity to drive change, champion fairness and reform multilateralism, including the expansion of the Security Council memberships. India is clearly in a hurry, and perhaps rightly so. Is India's patience inexhaustible?
Well, India's patience is certainly not inexhaustible, but India can do very little about it because the UN Charter is framed in such a way that there is a stranglehold over any reform in the UN Charter unless the permanent five, each of the permanent five, agrees. And the summit that is forthcoming up is extremely important, but we have had two other summits, the Millennium Summit that took place in the year 2000, and then the summit in the year 2005, which was the 60th anniversary of the UN, in which India made a very strong bid along with the other three G4 members, Japan, Brazil, and Germany. But eventually the resolution was not pressed for a vote because in Africa there was no consensus on the African representation, as a result of which India had to take into account these geopolitical realities and hold back on the resolution. And that problem will come up even now. But the real problem is that as a result of the UN Security Council not including countries like India, the Security Council itself is losing its relevance. And today, the main peace efforts, whether in Ukraine or in the Gaza war, are taking place outside the UN, and it's the other countries that are trying to bring about peace. That there are consultations taking place among different countries, but the UN itself and the Security Council in particular is simply deadlocked. So it's a question of the UN's survival rather than India's membership of it that is really the challenge before the UN today.
Indeed, Ambassador Sinha, what does India want to see happen? One, India as a permanent UN Security Council member. Two, with a veto. Three, more non-permanent members, or all of the above?
I would say all of the above, because India is not only advocating its own membership, but along with it, the membership of the three other G4 countries that I just mentioned. In addition, India wants 2 seats for Africa in the permanent category, and an overall expansion of the non-permanent seats as well. This will ensure that the Security Council starts representing the current geopolitical realities. As the Secretary General himself had said, that the world has changed, but the UN institutions have not. And that is what India wants to see happen, that Africa gets due representation, as, for example, it did in the case of the G20, where it got the African Union to come in. Now, that could be a possible way out for Security Council reform, where the African Union could be the representative of Africa. But that, of course, will depend upon the negotiations that take place in the UN. But the way forward would have to be something like that, which enables the African countries to come to a consensus on their representation. And then, of course, the G4, which is the
Right.
4 major powers that are not yet permanent members, that could bring about a compromise, which could bring about change and the expansion of the Security Council in both categories, permanent and non-permanent.
And finally, very quickly, if you will, Ambassador Sinha, could you give our viewers an overview of India's association with the UN since its inception? We are told India was a founding member at the 1945 San Francisco Conference, and India is also the largest troop contributing country, is it not?
Yes, India in fact has played a stellar role in the UN the UN itself. India played a very prominent role in the when the San Francisco Conference took place in 1945, where India, although not an independent country, had a representative there who played a very active role in the formulation of the charter and made some very useful suggestions, including on how the UN reform could take place after a period of 10 years. So the charter itself provided for a conference to take place after 10 years to reform the UN. Thereafter, once the UN was formed, then India spearheaded two very important movements, one for decolonization, because 2/3 of the world population was at that time under colonial rule, and the other was against apartheid in South Africa. And India then also spearheaded the non-aligned movement. Then India moved forward on the new international economic order and the new information order. All these were important contributions of India. And then when the UN Security Council was not able to get a UN army because of the opposition of the permanent members, and the first Secretary General, Trygve Lie, and thereafter Dag Hammarskjöld, came up with the idea of UN peacekeeping forces, then India became one of the prime supporters of the UN peacekeeping forces, and India has participated in the largest number of UN peacekeeping forces, also contributed historically the largest number of peacekeepers, and also shaped the very idea of peacekeeping, especially in the time of the Congo crisis in 1960. So since then, India has been active in all spheres of the UN's work, and it continues to do so. And this is one of the major reasons why India feels that it is a legitimate claim to become a permanent member of the Security Council.
All right. On that note, Ambassador Dileep Sinha, thank you. And thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts and insights with our viewers at home and abroad. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.